Be careful what you wish for, you may receive it. The Monkey's Paw by W. W. Jacobs. Part 1. Outside, the night was cold and wet, but in the small living room of the Whites' house the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Mr. White and his son Herbert were playing chess. Mr. White, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical chances, put his king into such sharp and unnecessary dangers that it even provoked comment from his white-haired wife, who sat knitting placidly by the fire. "Listen to the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake in his chess game after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said Herbert grimly, surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Check." "I should hardly think that he'd come tonight," said his father, with his hand poised over the board. "Mate!" replied his son. "That's the worst of living out so far," bawled Mr. White with sudden and unlooked-for violence. "Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live, this is the worst. Past a bog, and the road's a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses in the road are rented, they think it doesn't matter." "Never mind, dear," said his wife soothingly. "Perhaps you'll win the next one." Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between Mrs. White and their son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thin gray beard. "There he is," said Herbert White, as the gate banged loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. Mr. White rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door, was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said "Tut, tut!" and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage. "Sergeant Major Morris," said Mr. White, introducing his friend. The sergeant major took hands, and taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly as his host got out whiskey and glasses and stood a small copper kettle on the fire to make tea. At the third glass of whiskey his eyes got brighter, and he began to talk, the little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor who had lived in India, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange peoples. "21 years of this lifestyle he's had," said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. "When he went away he was a young man working in the warehouse. Now look at him." "He don't look to have taken much harm," said Mrs. White politely. "I like to go to India myself," said Mr. White, "just to look around a bit, you know." "Better where you are," said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass, and sighing softly, shook it again. "I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers," said Mr. White. "What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris?" "Nothing," said Morris hastily. "Leastways, nothing worth hearing." "Monkey's paw?" said Mrs. White curiously. "Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps," said Sergeant Major Morris offhandedly. His 3 listeners leaned forward eagerly. Morris absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips, and then set it down again. Mr. White filled it for him again. "To look at," said the sergeant major, fumbling in his pocket, "it's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy." He took something out of his pocket and held it out. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but Herbert, taking it, examined it curiously. "And what is there special about it?" inquired Mr. White as he took it from his son, and having examined it, placed it upon the table. "It had a spell put on it by an old fakir," said the sergeant major, "a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and those that interfered with fate did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it, so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it." "Well, why don't you make 3 wishes, sir?" said Herbert White cleverly. Morris looked at him the way that middle age often looks at presumptuous youth. "I have," he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. "And did you really have the 3 wishes granted?" asked Mrs. White. "I did," said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. "And has anybody else wished?" persisted Mrs. White. "The first man had his 3 wishes." "Yes," replied Morris. "I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw." His tones were so grave that a hush fell upon the group. "If you've had your 3 wishes, "It's no good to you now, then, Morris," said Mr. White at last. "What do you keep it for?" The soldier shook his head. "Fancy, I suppose," he said slowly. "I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused me enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale, some of them, and those who do think anything of it want to try it first and pay me afterward." "If you could have another 3 wishes," said Mr. White, eyeing him keenly, "would you have them?" "I don't know," said Morris. "I don't know." He took the paw, and dangling it between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. Mr. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. "Better let it burn," said Morris solemnly. "If you don't want it, Morris," said Mr. White, "give it to me." "I won't," said his friend doggedly. "I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Throw it back on the fire like a sensible man." Mr. White shook his head and examined his possession closely. "How do you do it?" he inquired. "Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud," said the sergeant major. "But I warn you of the consequences." "Sounds like the Arabian Nights," said Mrs. White, as she rose and began to set the table for supper. "Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me?" Her husband drew the talisman from his pocket, and all 3 burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. "If you must wish," he said gruffly, "wish for something sensible." Mr. White dropped the monkey's paw back in his pocket, and placing chairs around the table, motioned his friend to come and eat. In the business of supper the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the 3 sat listening in an enthralled fashion to more stories of Morris's adventures in India. "If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than the tales he's been telling us all night," said Herbert, after Morris had left in time to catch the last train, "we won't get much out of it." "Did you give anything for it, father?" inquired Mrs. White, watching her husband closely. "Just a little," said he, coloring slightly. "He didn't want it, but I made him take it. And he urged me again to throw it away." "That's not likely to happen," said Herbert with pretended horror. "Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be a king, father, to begin with. Then you can't be henpecked by mother." He ran around the table, pursued by the maligned Mrs. White, armed with a dish towel. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it doubtfully. "I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact," he said slowly. "It seems to me I've got all I want." "If you only paid off the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you?" said Herbert, with his hand on his father's shoulder. "Well, wish for $200 then. That'll just do it." His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman, and his son, with a solemn face, somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down and struck a few impressive chords on the piano. "I wish for £200," said Mr. White distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted his words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from Mr. White. His wife and son ran toward him. "It moved!" he cried, with a glance of disgust at the monkey's paw as it lay on the floor. "As I wished, the paw twisted in my hand like a snake." "Well, I don't see the money," said Herbert, as he picked up the paw and placed it on the table, "and I bet I never shall." "It must have been your imagination, father," said Mrs. White, regarding her husband anxiously. Mr. White shook his head. "No, it wasn't. Never mind, though. There's no harm done, but it gave me a shock all the same." They sat down by the fire again while the 2 men finished smoking their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and Mr. White jumped nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. An unusual and depressing silence settled on all 3 of them, which lasted until Mr. and Mrs. White rose to go to bed. "I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed," said Herbert, as he bade them good night, "and something horrible squatting on top of your wardrobe watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains." After that, Herbert sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that with a little uneasy laugh he felt on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. Instead of the glass, his hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. II. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, Herbert laughed at his fears. There was an air of prosaic wholesomeness about the room which it had lacked on the previous night, and the dirty, shriveled little paw was tossed on a side table with a carelessness that showed no great belief in its power to grant wishes. "I suppose all old soldiers are the same," said Mrs. White. "The idea of our listening to such nonsense! How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how could $200 hurt you, father?" "It might drop on his head from the sky," said the frivolous Herbert. "Morris said the things happened so naturally," said Mr. White, "that you might, if you wanted to, think it was just coincidence." "Well, don't spend all the money before I come back," said Herbert, as he rose from the table. "I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, avaricious man, and we shall have to disown you." His mother laughed, and following him to the door, watched him go down the road to work. In returning to the breakfast table, teased Mr. White about his willingness to believe in the power of the monkey's paw. However, this did not prevent her from hurrying to the door at the mailman's knock, nor prevent her from referring somewhat shortly to retired sergeant majors of bibulous habits when she found that the mail had brought a tailor's bill. "Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home," she said, as they sat at dinner. "I dare say," said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer. "But for all that, the thing moved in my hand. That I'll swear to." "You thought it did," said Mrs. White soothingly. "I say it did," replied Mr. White. "There was no thought about it. I had just— What's the matter?" Mrs. White didn't answer. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, looking up at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. Thinking of the man as possibly connected with the $200, she noticed that he was well dressed, and wore a glossy new silk hat. 3 times he passed by the house, paused at the gate, and then walked away. The 4th time he stood with his hand on the gate, and then with sudden resolution pushed it open and walked up the path to the house. Mrs. White quickly took off her apron and hid it under the cushion of her chair. She opened the door for the stranger, who seemed uncomfortable, and brought him into the room. He gazed at her furtively, and listened in a preoccupied fashion as Mrs. White apologized for the appearance of the room and the fact that Mr. White was dressed in his garden coat. She then waited as patiently as any female could for him to explain why he had come, but he was at first strangely silent. "I was asked to come by," he said at last, and stooped and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers. "I come from Ma and Megan's." Mrs. White started. "Is anything the matter?" she asked breathlessly. "Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it?" Mr. White interposed. "There, there, Mother," he said hastily. "Sit down and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir," he said, eyeing the stranger wistfully. "I'm sorry," began the visitor. "Is he hurt?" demanded Mrs. White wildly. The visitor nodded. "Badly hurt," he said quietly, "but he is not in any pain." "Oh, thank God!" said the old woman, clasping her hands. "Thank God for that! Thank—" She broke off as she realized the terrible meaning of what the man had said, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in his averted face. She caught her breath, and turning to her slower-witted husband, laid her trembling hand on his. There was a long silence. "He was caught in the machinery," said the visitor, after a while, in a low voice. "Caught in the machinery," repeated Mr. White, in a dazed fashion. "Yes." Mr. White sat staring out the window, and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it as he had used to do in their old courting days nearly 40 years before. "He was the only one left to us," he said, turning gently to the visitor. "It is hard." The visitor coughed, and rising, walked slowly to the window. "The company wishes me to express their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss," he said, without looking at Mr. and Mrs. White. "I beg that you will understand I am only their messenger, and only obeying orders." There was no reply. Mrs. White's face was white, her eyes staring, and her breath hard to hear. On Mr. White's face was a look such as Sergeant Major Morris might have carried into his first battle. "I am supposed to say that Ma and Meggins disclaim all responsibility," continued the visitor. "They do not admit any fault at all, but because of your son's service to the company, they wish to present you with a certain amount of money as compensation." Mr. White dropped his wife's hand, and rising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words, "How much?" $200 was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's shriek, Mr. White smiled faintly, put out his hands like a sightless man and fainted. Part 3. In the huge new cemetery, some 2 miles distant, Mr. and Mrs. White buried their dead son, and came back to the house steeped in shadows and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it, and remained in a state of expectation as though something else would happen, something else which was to lighten this load, which was too heavy for their old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and they stopped expecting something to happen, and became resigned, the hopeless resignation of old people, sometimes mistaken for not caring. Some days they hardly said a word to each other, for without Herbert they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long and wearisome. It was about a week after Herbert's death that Mr. White, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found that Mrs. White was not in bed. The room was in darkness, and the sound of quiet crying came from the window. He raised himself in bed and listened. "Come back," he said tenderly. "You'll be cold." "It's colder for my son," said Mrs. White, weeping harder. The sound of her sobs died away on his ears. The bed was warm, and his eyes heavy with sleep. He dozed fitfully, and then slept, until a sudden wild cry from Mrs. White awoke him with a start. "The paw!" she cried wildly. "The monkey's paw!" He jumped in alarm. "Where? Where is it? What's the matter?" She came stumbling across the room toward him. "I want it," she said quietly. "You haven't destroyed it, have you?" "It's in the living room, on the bracket," he replied, wondering. "Why?" She cried and laughed at the same time, and bending over kissed his cheek. "I only just thought of it," she said hysterically. "Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?" "Think of what?" he questioned. "The other 2 wishes," she replied rapidly. "We've only had one." "Wasn't that enough?" he demanded fiercely. "No!" she cried triumphantly. "We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly, and wish Herbert alive again." Mr. White sat in bed and flung the bedclothes from his shaking limbs. "Good heavens, you're crazy!" he cried, aghast. "Get it!" she panted. "Get it quickly and wish. Oh, my boy, my boy!" Her husband struck a match and lit the candle. "Get back to bed," he said unsteadily. "You don't know what you're saying." "We had the first wish granted," said Mrs. White feverishly. "Why not the second?" "It was a coincidence," stammered Mr. White. "Go get it and wish," cried his wife, quivering with excitement. Mr. White turned and looked at her, and his voice shook. "He's been dead 10 days, and besides I would not tell you otherwise, but I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how will he look now?" "Bring him back," cried Mrs. White, and dragged him towards the door. "Do you think I fear the child I've nursed?" He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the living room, and then to the mantelpiece. The monkey's paw was there, and a horrible fear seized him that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated son before him before he could escape from the room, and he caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction to the door. His forehead cold with sweat, he felt his way around the table and groped along the wall until he found himself in the small hallway with the monkey's paw in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered their bedroom. It was white and expectant, and it seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her. "Wish!" she cried in a strong voice. "It's foolish and wicked," he faltered. "Wish!" repeated his wife. He raised his hand. "I wish my son alive again." The monkey's paw fell to the floor, and he looked at it fearfully. Then he sank, trembling, into a chair as Mrs. White, with burning eyes, walked to the window and raised the blinds. He sat until he was chilled with the cold, glancing occasionally at Mrs. White as she gazed through the window. The candle, which had burned below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls until, with a flicker larger than the rest, it went out. Mr. White, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the monkey's paw, crept back to his bed, and a minute afterward Mrs. White came silently and apathetically beside him. Neither spoke, but sat silently listening to the ticking of the clock. A stair creaked, and a squeaky mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time gathering his courage, he took the box of matches, and striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs the match went out, and he paused to strike another, and at the same moment a knock sounded on the front door, so quiet and stealthy that it was hard to hear it. The matches fell from his hand and spilled in the passage. He stood motionless, his breath suspended, until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and fled swiftly back to the room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house. "What's that?" cried Mrs. White, starting up. "A rat," said Mr. White, his voice shaking. "It's just a rat. It passed me on the stairs." His wife sat up in bed, listening. A loud knock resounded through the house. "It's Herbert!" She ran to the door, but her husband was ahead of her, and catching her by the arm, held her tightly. "What are you going to do?" he whispered hoarsely. "It's my boy! It's Herbert!" she cried, struggling mechanically. "I forgot it was 2 miles to the cemetery. He had to walk. What are you holding me for? Let go! I must open the door." "For God's sake, don't let it in!" cried Mr. White, trembling. "You're afraid of your own son!" she cried, struggling. "Let me go! I'm coming, Herbert! I'm coming!" There was another knock, and another. Mrs. White, with a sudden wrench, broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed her to the top of the stairs and called after her appealingly as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain of the door rattle back and the bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. Then Mrs. White's voice, strained and panting. "The bolt!" she cried loudly. "Come down! I can't reach it!" But her husband was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the monkey's paw. If only he could find it before the thing outside got in! A perfect fusillade of knocks reverberated through the house, and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife pulled it up against the door to help her reach the bolt. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same moment he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking stopped suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair pulled away from the door, and the door opened. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud cry of disappointment and misery from Mrs. White gave him the courage to run down to her, and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp, flickering opposite, shone on a quiet and deserted road.